And joining us now to talk about these new developments in the Ukraine crisis is James Jatras. He's with the American Institute in Ukraine and a regular visitor here to our show. Thanks again for joining us. Jim, what's your take on what we're seeing here, the very latest uptick in violence in the region? Is this just another flash in what's been happening for months?
I don't think so. And as you saw in the report about the shelling that's going on in Donetsk, that really has been going on sporadically since the ceasefire started in September. There still has been fighting around Donetsk airport. And I think a lot of people on the anti-Kiev side felt that, frankly, Moscow had jerked their chain and pulled them back when they were on a very successful offensive in the expectation of a negotiated settlement, as the Chinese government spokesman pointed out. And that just hasn't happened. So now I think they are going on the offensive, and Mr. Zakharchenko, their prime minister, says they will continue until they reach the borders of the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts.
But let's talk about this ceasefire, or the ceasefire that some say never was, because there were, violations by both sides, if you talk to people there. How do you get back to that if it didn't really seem to work in the first place?
I think a ceasefire, I agree that a ceasefire is always a good idea. People not getting killed is always a good idea. But that has to be followed by a genuine effort to reach a diplomatic settlement, a political settlement. And that simply did not happen. And I think there's a lot of blame to go around, but I think one of the problems was internally within Kiev and the various factions inside the Ukrainian government, there could not be any real agreement on decentralization and autonomy for the eastern oblasts. And instead, what we're seeing is a fourth round of mobilization of people being drafted into the army for a military solution. And I don't think that's going to work.
EU ministers are meeting on Thursday. They're considering additional sanctions on Russia. You have that, and then you have other countries talking about another aid package to Ukraine. So we're talking about money here, throwing money at the problem or taking money away. What will work? It's not working so far.
Well, sanctions certainly will not work. I don't see any evidence that the kind of sanctions that they're talking about will have any impact on the situation. And frankly, I don't think the Europeans are in a position to do that. We'll look at the Greek situation and so forth. As far as throwing the kind of money at Kiev that they say they need, $15 billion immediately on top of the $17 billion already approved by the IMF and now in jeopardy. George Soros says they need $50 billion. And what's really being talked about are loan guarantees in the amount of $500 million. It's just nowhere near what they need to stay solvent.
Ukraine is in serious trouble anyway with its economy, notwithstanding the conflict that is taking place. Let's talk about the people in the area, the civilians that are in the middle of all this. More than 1 million people have fled the fighting, 5 million living in the immediate conflict zone. This is also a humanitarian issue as well.
Absolutely. And that's the real tragedy of all this. This is why, instead of talking about sanctions or the bottom line is there has to be a political solution in Ukraine. There has to be real financial support from both Europe and Russia and the Americans, but that has to be based on a political solution, decentralization, neutrality. Look, everybody, Henry Kissinger, people have been talking about this for months and months while people continue to die. But the political will does not exist to reach that solution. And until it does, this is going to continue.
Who makes the first step?
I think, frankly, the first step has to be made by Washington, but in a sort of a negative sense, which is to stop trying to push the Europeans into a stronger confrontation than they're comfortable with, and frankly, let the Europeans and the Russians sort this out.
All right, take a step back. James Jatras, as always, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And your perspective on this.